Hi everyone. Just going to check my advanced properties. Left white balance is fine. In fact, I can turn the volume down just a wee bit. Around about here or so. There we go. It's not going into the yellow and get distorted. Hello everyone. Um, yes, no face thing today. So basically, I might change my input. Sorry about this, guys. Don't face hints. Sounds. Properties. Levels. There, I put it down to 75%, so hopefully it's not too distorting. Hello everyone, I finally got my fucking, wankers. Sorry, I was a tick. I finally got my damn OBS to work, so now we can go through and it should be, A-OK in terms of, so I'll see how it is on the screen so you can see it. So this is chapter 3 of A Very Capitalist Condition, the social model and its critics. And this is a very dense, not dense, but this is where I get really into what social model actually is as a political construct, as a construct of disabled liberation. And hopefully this format helps a lot of people, because I know with my accent, sometimes people struggle, and this is better than having captions. So here we go. So here's social model. In themselves, social model in the I will have some comments sprinkle throughout this chapter. In the end, I'll have my own thoughts about how this affected me. So yeah, hopefully you like the new format. I will be going through other books, not just disability ones. So yeah, in themselves, handicaps are no wise tragic, but through the eyes of others, through their voices and their actions, we are constantly made aware that it is, and the sea of these white missionaries is so great that they make converts of us. Some falling rapidly into their concepts of our conditions, and some of us, less fortunate, struggling against the sly of tragedy. The issue today, the issue of what disability really is, has been debated for the past half century. The first disability activists drew parallels with other oppressed groups while grappling with the distinctive features of disability. I'm just going to identify my wee bit. There we go. Drew parallels with other oppressed disability. Where and how to draw a line between limitations imposed upon individuals by particular impairments on the one hand, and their widely varying experiences of social discrimination on the other hand, remains a complex issue. This chapter critically assesses what is by far the most important and successful attempt to meet this challenge: the social model of disability. The rise of the social model of disability. The Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation, UPIAS, which will be what's going to be called from now on, will be one of many small groups of radical socialists in Britain during the early 1970s. UPAIS members felt that a new interpretation of disability was necessary to challenge the traditional tragedy view of disability. Their discussions were to lead to the British disability movement's big idea. UPass, we call it UPass, began with an initiative by Paul Hunt, a resident of Leacourt, a Leonard Lincolnshire Foundation home. He had already written about the segregation characterising the lives of many disabled people in Britain. At a time when the struggle against racism in the US had reached its peak, Stigma, the Experience of Disability, a series of essays by disabled men and women, was one of the first books focusing on social rather than biological factors in understanding disability. Hunt's piece argued that we do not enjoy many of the goods that people in our society are accustomed to. Employers turn away qualified, incompetent workers simply because they are disabled. Restaurants and pubs give transparent excuses for the refusing our custom. Landladies reject disabled lodgers. Parents and relatives fight the marriage of a cripple into their family. Perhaps with more reason than with a black African, but with many of the same arguments. And it's not hard to see the analogy between a racial ghetto and the institutions where disabled people are put away and given enough care to solve society's conscience. That means just to deal with the conscience of people these people exist in. Hunt went on to lead a rebellion by residents to secure representation on Leacourt's board of management, gaining for the first time a say in how the home is run. In fact, I'm going to talk about this in next in the book called No Limits, which goes in the history of disabled movement, including the wife of Paul Hunt, Judy Hunt. So stay tuned for that. If you want to know more about this kind of history, I will in the future do that. In September 1972, he wrote a letter to the Guardian newspaper calling for a new organisation of disabled people to campaign against segregation in institutions. Among those who responded was Vic Falkenstein, who had moved to Britain after being banished from South Africa for involvement in the anti-apartheid movement. Until his exchanges with Hunt, Falkenstein had not thought of experiences as a wheelchair user as discrimination. Ironically, the apartheid regime had freed him early from prison sentence because he was, quote, a cripple. He began to draw parallels between the systemic racism in his homeland and the experience of disabled people. Hunt, in turn, generalised his earlier insights into a wider understanding of disability discrimination. UPa's founding members, Falkenstein wrote letters, withdrew in practice if not intention from the public arena and engaged in private discussions about the meaning of disability. He spent about 2 or 3 years exchanging ideas in an internal circular because of the practical difficulties in meeting. Sorry about that. My mum found internal circular because of the practical difficulties in meeting. The most important issue to be resolved was the relationship between impairment and disability. Having an impairment is a prerequisite for being a disabled person, but having an impairment cannot cause a person to become disabled. Even losing an arm and an eye does not make a disabled person. The national culture would have to attribute certain characteristics to such impairments before designating the person as being disabled. Once those attributes are embedded in the national culture and accepted as defining features of disability, then impairments such as missing an arm and an eye would not only formally become disabilities, but they would be seen as the dominant characteristic of the individual, i.e., the person would be labelled disabled. In such a society, acquiring certain culturally identifiable impairments transforms the individual at the same time into a person with a disability. Both impairment and disability then become attributes located within the individual. Thereafter, the two conditions can be swiftly difficult to disentangle. In 1975, UPAS were invited by the newly formed Disability Alliance to join the campaign for a comprehensive income scheme for all disabled people. Their subsequent discussions formed the text for the UPS fundamental principles, which I'll read out later. Hunt and his allies saw the Alliance and its predecessor, the Disablement Income Group, as being too vague on the meaning and causes of disability. Where Alliance was a coalition of disability groups and non-disabled academics, UPAS wanted to create a mass grassroots organisation comprising only disabled people. For them, poverty was a symptom of our oppression, but it is not the cause. It is absolutely vital that we get this question of the cause of disability quite straight, because on the answer depends the critical matter of where we direct our main energies in the struggle for change. To quote the perspective at a greater length, if disability is a social condition, then analysis of the ways in which society actually disables physically impaired people is obviously required before the condition can be eliminated. In our view, it is society which disabled physically impaired people. Disability is something imposed on top of our impairments by the way we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. Disabled people are therefore an oppressed group in society. To understand this, it is necessary to grasp the distinction between the physical impairment and the social situation, called disability, of people with such impairment. Thus we define impairment as a lacking part or all of a limb, or having a defective limb, organ, or mechanism of the body, and disability as a disadvantage or restriction of activity caused by a contemporary social organisation which takes no or little account of people who have physical impairments, and thus excludes them from participation in the mainstream of social activities. Physical disability is therefore a particular form of social oppression. It is clear that our social organisation does not discriminate equally against all physical impairments, and hence there arises the appearance of degrees of exclusion, degrees of disability. For example, people having mild visual impairments, wearing glasses, are doubtless not more impoverished than their visibly unimpaired peers. A social organisation does not exclude people using glasses to the same extent that it excludes people who are blind, deaf, or cannot speak, or who have brain damage, or who use wheelchairs. Nonetheless, it is the same society which disabled people, whatever their type or degree of physical impairment, and therefore there is a single cause within the organisation of society that is responsible for the creation of the disability of physically impaired people. At this stage, then, UPAS had identified disability as a specific type of discrimination in modern society. They saw this social understanding of disability as the key political basis for a future independent democratic organisation of disabled people, which is increasingly clear about the cause of disability and about the changes required to overcome it. Another wheelchair user, Mike Oliver, along with others such as Falkenstein, developed this critical distinction between impairment and disability into the social model of disability during the course of the 1980s, particularly in his influential book The Politics of Disablement, which first appeared in 1990. His conception of two contrasting modes of disability, as he later explained, was taken quite simply and explicitly from the distinction already made by Upas. The originality conceptualized models of disability as the binary distinction between what I choose to call the individual and social models of disability. This was no amazing new insight on my part dreamed up in some ivory tower, but was really an attempt to enable me to make sense of the world for the social work students and the professionals who I was teaching at the time. The social model was received much more enthusiastically by disabled people because it made an immediate connection to their own experiences. It quickly became the basis for disability awareness and later disability equality training. It was adopted by democratic disability organisations all over the world, including Disabled People's International and the British Council of Organisations of Disabled People. Oliver also developed the social model as a response to his own experiences as a disabled activist. When we were trying to build a sort of coalition across impairments, I started meeting blind people and deaf people. We spent the first couple of years trying to imagine what it would be like to be someone else. I would say to a blind person, "Core, I'm glad I'm not blind," and they would say, "I'd rather be blind and in a wheelchair like you." We realised it was not about trying to understand how we felt about each other. It was about trying to understand why we all had crappy lives. This new concept was a direct political challenge to the way disability was commonly understood. Oliver, who broke his neck in a driving accident at the age of 17, later explained this with reference to his own experience of impairment. "I don't see myself as a person with a disability. Black people don't want to be seen as people with a different coloured skin, women as people with a different genital arrangement. You have to find ways of recognising, valuing and respecting difference rather than ignoring it. I don't want you to understand what it's like to have no control over bladder or bowel. I want you to understand that I need a job, to use the same public spaces and facilities as you, that I need a decent education, and a house with a front door I own, and to control who comes in. I want you to understand these things. I don't need you to understand that I sit in this wheelchair from the neck down without feeling anything and what it feels like, because I don't know what it's like to have a period. In order to be sensitive about it, I don't need to know about it." The social model was not, in other words, about the particularities of each individual's impairments. It was instead a way of illustrating the nature of disability as a specific form of discrimination, which was ultimately due to our continued exclusion from the processes of production. The social model of disability is concerned with the personal and collective experiences of disabling social barriers and how its application might influence personal practice and shape political action. The social model, therefore, is above all intended as a practical tool. This new way of looking at disability turned received wisdom on its head and had a hugely liberating impact on many disabled individuals. It helped many activists, particularly in Britain, understand and challenge discrimination. It won widespread acceptance as the disability movement grew under Margaret Thatcher's Tory government in the 1980s. It also led to the establishment of a new academic discipline, disability studies, and was used to train social service professionals. The social model's influence was evident, albeit in highly diluted form, in the Disability Discrimination Act, its subsequent amendments in 2005, as well as the Equality Act of 2010. As Colin Burns explained, the social model of disabilities emphasis on disabling social and environmental barriers was contrasted with the current orthodoxy that viewed disability as a personal tragedy and disabled people as in need of care. Oliver drew on contemporary debates in social sciences to explain this individualized approach to disability as a social creation of industrial capitalism. Moreover, the social model approach pointed to areas where political action might bring about the social changes necessary to overturn the social exclusion of disabled people. Although UPass had only applied its fundamental principles to people with physical impairments, the distinction between disability and impairment could readily be applied to differences faced by other groups of disabled people. Oliver was only too aware that the success of the social model was a double-edged, and that many of its new converts had a commitment to it that was superficial at best. The social model has been incorporated into the agendas and practices of governments, welfare agencies, quangos, Quancon government organisations, charities, and a variety of other organisations worldwide without any substantial change to their practices. We still have international charities who incarcerate disabled people all over the world claiming to work to the principles of the social model. And governments who endorse it yet continue providing individualising responses to the problems of unemployment and discrimination. As the leaders of the disability movement in the UK increasingly placed their hopes in a future New Labour government, the social model began to be identified with a rights model centred on achieving legislative change, and at the same time to be challenged outright for its perceived inadequacies. Critics. The first challenges to the social model came from within the disabled movement. Shortly after the publication of Oliver's The Politics of Disablement. Do I have that book? No. Here we go. In 1982, Les Crowe argued that the social model needed to be renewed, and later critics argued that it had been rectified. Vic Filkenstein noted, by the year 2000, the rectifiers were secure enough to state, we need to produce an updated social model disability that includes a positive statement above us, recognises our diversity and difference, recognises institutionalised discrimination, talk about choice, recognises that not all the things that exclude us are about society's barriers. This statement is generalised enough to cover all human and social behaviour and is quite useless as a disability model. A real shopping basket approach which enables people to pick and choose any interpretation which happen to suit their personal ambitions. And it perfectly matches the privatisation programme of New Labour for a free market in health and social services. The most sustained and serious challenge to the social model came from a former supporter, disability studies academic and activist Tom Shakespeare. He argued in 2002 that the social model had become outdated and a new orthodoxy. 4 years later, in his book Disability Rights and Wrongs, he compared the disability movement in the UK to a fundamentalist religion, because, in his view, the model had not been developed or revised or rethought for 30 years. With Shakespeare, the social model defined impairment as an individual in biological terms, in practice ignoring impairment altogether to focus on disability as a form of oppression, which by definition had been socially created. Accepting many parallels between disability and other forms of oppression, Shakespeare argued that impairment had an inextricable interconnection to disability. The oppression which disabled people face is different from, and in many ways more complex, than sexism, racism, and homophobia. Even in the absence of social barriers or oppression, it would still be problematic to have an impairment, because many impairments are limiting or difficult. In most cases, disabled people are experiencing both the intrinsic limitation of impairment and the externally imposed social discrimination. On one level, this argument is clearly correct. Disability does differ from other equality strands, as they are now called, just as they differ from each other. However, Shakespeare's argument is that the nature of impairment dictates that disabled people will always face disadvantage. For him, it is not so easy to distinguish between impairment and disability. The strong social model, this is Oliver's version, overstates the social creation of disability and fails to give an adequate account of the complexities of disabled people's lives. This charge drew the following response from Michael Oliver and Colin Burns. The distinction between impairment and disability is a pragmatic one that does not deny that some impairments limit people's ability to function independently. Nor does it deny that disabled people have illnesses that various points in their lives that appropriate medical interventions are sometimes necessary. But independence is a relative concept. Human beings are social, and no one, regardless of impairment, can function completely independently. Oliver also pointed out that the social model is a campaigning aid concentrating on the collective experience of disablement, not the individual experience of impairment. Drawing on the precedents of the struggles for black, gay, and women's liberation and rejecting biological explanations of social inequality, he insisted that there is no causal relationship between impairment and disability. The question of impairment. Paul Aberle had already argued in 1987 that the social model viewed impairment as an individual in biological terms, and that its supporters rarely examined or questioned it as a concept. Impairment always and only occurs in a particular social and historical context which determines its nature. Where a given impairment may be perceived, eradicated, or its effects significantly ameliorated, it can no longer be regarded as a simple natural phenomenon. By their very nature, human beings are unnatural. We do not yet walk naturally on hind legs, for example. Such ills as fallen arches, lower back pain, and hernias testify that the body has not adapted itself completely to the upright posture. Yet this unnatural posture, forced on the unwilling body by the project of tool using, is precisely what has made possible certain aspects of our nature, the hand and the brain, and the complex system of skills, language, and social arrangements, which were both effects and causes of hand and brain. Man-made and psychological structures have thus come to penetrate so thoroughly that to call a human project contrary to human biology is naive. We are what we have made ourselves, and we must continue to make ourselves as long as we exist at all. Aberle argued that disability differs from other forms of oppression in one respect in particular. While in cases of sexual and racial oppression, biological differences serves only as a qualificatory condition, and that means basically they're used as to distinguish between each other, basically. Of a wholly ideological oppression, for disabled people, the biological difference, a consequence of social practices, it in itself a part of the oppression. It is critical that a theory of disability as oppression comes to grips with the real inferiority, since forms of bedrock upon which justificatory oppressive theories are based, and, psychologically, an immense impediment to the development of political consciousness amongst disabled people. Such a development is systemically blocked through the naturalization of impairment. That really normal ideology finds its expression in everyday life in the exceptionalism of "but I don't think of you as disabled," denying a key aspect of a disabled person's identity in what is intended as a compliment. Compare this to the phrase to played like a white man and she thinks like a man. For disability discrimination to be seen as analogous to racial and sexual oppression, it must be demonstrated that disadvantage for disabled people is ultimately a social, not a biological product. Olive oneself conceded that an adequate social theory of disability must contain a theory of impairment. Abeles' starting point was that, as far as the majority of the world's disabled people are concerned, impairment is very clearly primarily of significant consequence of the social and political factors, not an unavoidable fact of nature. He provides a range of examples to illustrate this. At the World Mental Health Congress in Brighton in July 1985, Dr. David Hill, senior psychologist, argued that 25 million patients throughout the world had suffered irreversible brain damage as a result of the administration of powerful tranquilizers such as Laraquil. Polio is by no means a disease of civilization. Recurrent outbreaks are still endemic in much of the world, where vaccination has been seen as unnecessary or where methods of administration have been ineffective. Such a view does not deny the significance of germs, genes, and trauma, but rather points out that their effects are only ever apparent in a real social and historical context, whose nature is determined by a complex interaction of material and non-material factors. For example, while the link between tobacco consumption and lung cancer, bronchitis, and ischemic heart disease is demonstrated a material one, the occurrence and incidence of tobacco consumption is to be understood primarily in terms of social factors, as is the level and kind of ameliorative provision available, peer pressure and the like. Advances in science and technology mean that the point at which impairment becomes classified as disability changes. To take the example of visual impairments, the recent advent of laser treatment in particular means that many of its less serious forms, for example short or long-sightedness and astigmatisms, can be rectified provided that there is access to treatment. Most people who wear glasses neither think of themselves as disabled nor are regarded as such by others. This is in turn linked to social expectations. Until recently, for example, it was commonly seen as embarrassing for women to wear spectacles as it undermined sexual attractiveness. Boys seldom make passes at girls who wear glasses, or indicated high or supposedly unfeminine intelligence. In this case, therefore, impairment became linked to sexism, another form of oppression. Most impairments are acquired over the course of an individual's lifetime, and a large proportion occur at work. The website of Britain's Health and Safety Executive, HSE, for example, shows an estimated 1.2 million people in 2013 to 14 are suffering from an illness they believe was caused or made worse by work. Musculoskeletal disorders, stress, depression and anxiety accounted for 80% of new work-related conditions in 2013 to 14. HSE research suggests about half of the reduction in non-fatal injuries up to 2012 was linked to changing employment patterns and occupations. The medical model. We'll make all of our affairs to contrast individual or tragedy models of disability with the social model. Many of the latter's supporters perceive its opposite to be what they call the medical model of disability. Well-known US disability activist and writer Paul Longmore describes this model as follows. The medical model defines disability as the physical and psychological experience of biological defect deriving from any one of a series of illnesses or injuries located within the bodies of afflicted individuals. Medical practitioners have seen cure or at least correction of functioning as the only possible way to bring about the social integration of people with disabilities. Medical practice and research is focused on cures and treatment for illnesses and impairments. Disabled individuals have many times been made the objects of expert intervention, identified and often reduced to their particular impairment. Medical practitioners have for over a century determined who qualifies as disabled and therefore the eligibility for benefits, rights and services. The medical model sees the medical profession as a whole to be the source of disabled people's oppression. This approach is both highly undesirable and highly problematic. Understandable? It is true that disabled people have on many occasions been subject to appalling treatment at the hands of the medical and caring professions, as later trips in the book will show. Nevertheless, the medical model is a one-sided and unhelpful formulation. Firstly, it assumes the greatest difficulties faced by disabled people relate to medical conditions or are caused by medical staff, rather than wider social and economic factors. Medical practitioners do not, however, make and are rarely key in enforcing government policies, which they may in fact oppose. In addition, the medical profession is not homogeneous. Rather, it is historically shaped, internally differentiated and influenced by wider society. UK Doctors Organisation, the British Medical Association, for example, resisted the foundation of the NHS, but now presents itself as its strongest advocate. A vote at the BMA's 2013 annual congress also contributed to the removal of ATOS from its position administrating the notorious work benefit tests. Last but not least, those often most responsible for poor medical practice are not practitioners at all, but those who restrict or remove medical services from people who need them. The attitude of disabled people towards doctors has much to do with their status as gatekeepers who deny or confirm the legitimacy of someone suffering and therefore access to pensions or benefits, as well as to relief, drugs, or even a cure. In The Rejected Body, Feminist Philosophical Reflections on Disability. I forgot about that book. I'm going to thingy that there. Susan Wendell describes one patient with chronic and serious symptoms who expressed a sheer joy and relief on finally being diagnosed. We had a name to something. We could deal with it. It was not a neurotic lady. It was okay to slow down, to quit work. It was okay to say no to things. Another patient also described a feeling of euphoria. Something was wrong, and this is what it is. I remember feeling a kind of special and important. I could just have hugged that doctor for taking me seriously and deciding to get the bottom of this. The subjective nature and the diversity of impairment mean that some people may be desperate to give a label or a name to their pain or limitations, whereas others may be very hostile to this. The subject of medical cures or therapy often leads to lively debates among disabled people. The point here is that they are not incompatible with social change and civil rights. On the contrary, they have demonstrably helped to expand and improve human lives in general. The applicability in terms of individuals is usually a personal choice, albeit one influenced by a range of social factors. A series of alternative or additional modes of disability, such as the charity, moral, economic and affirmative models, have been mooted by other writers. One has had anywhere near the impact of the social model itself. One in particular, however, has become increasingly popular among policymakers in the advanced economies: the biopsychosocial model, a term borrowed from psychiatry which places the emphasis on the individual's behaviour as the primary factor in disability, represents a huge attack on disabled people by those responsible for producing a number of classified as such, cutting benefits and services in the name of reform and modernisation. Evaluating the social model today. As Oliver and Burns wrote in their 2012 book, The New Politics of Disablement, which revised Oliver's original work 22 years later, the social model is a simplified representation of a complex social reality. Although it has been linked to various theories of disablement, it is not a social theory. Oliver originally drew up the individual and social models of disability as a binary distinction to help the social work students he was then teaching to understand disability as a form of discrimination. The individual or tragedy model can easily be interpreted as a criticism of individuals. Coming to terms with disability can indeed feel like a tragedy. For many people, to be disabled means to be unattractive, unwanted, and a burden to others, a perception sometimes shared by parents or relatives of disabled children, and by the majority of disabled people who acquire impairment later in life, often due to an accident or sudden trauma. The social model's sheer simplicity and flexibility made it immensely useful as a campaigning tool. These same virtues, however, have facilitated its embrace by national and international bodies. Witness the following excerpt from Fulfilling Potential. One of a series of reports produced by the UK Coalition Government of 2010 to 15. For much of recent history, a medical model of disability, combined with a spirit of benevolence, often led to a focus solely on impairment, over deterministic, too prone to think in terms of blame, cure, and rehabilitation, and to treat disabled people as objects of pity and charity. The social model of disability, which is at the heart of the UN Convention, now commands much, but not full, support amongst disabled professionals and campaigners. It offers insights into the importance of attitudes, social support, and accessible information and environments in influencing the quality of life of disabled people. The social model, in other words, often seems to mean all things to all people. Acceptance by successive UK governments has not prevented savage cuts in disability-related benefits and services. These are necessary, but we are told in those familiar weasel words in order to target benefits at the most in need. Cuts in our benefits are now being justified on the grounds that the intention is to give more to those who are severely impaired and less to those who are not. Our differences are being used to slash our services as our needs are now being assessed as being moderate, substantial or critical, and many local authorities are not only providing services those needs are critical. It's taken us back to more than 30 years to the time before the social model came into existence. Those who have talked down the social model while failing to replace it with something more meaningful or useful must bear a heavy burden of responsibility for this state of affairs. Disabled people urgently need a reinvigorated social model or something new to replace it. As we shall see, some contemporary writers wish to extend the concept of social model into mental health, a complex venture which is nonetheless further evidence of the model's continuing relevance. Its survival serves as a conduit, often unwelcome reminder to disabled studies scholars of the origins of their discipline. This is in part the reason it continues to provoke such intense academic debate today. In a final instance, its value as a political tool has given it the durability it deserves. And we'll go on to chapter 4 next time. So, the social model of disability. For me, the social model of disability, is a major, problem, and it's that people don't understand it. The social model liberated me as a disabled person. That it is not me, it is not solely my responsibility. This rugged individualism hits disabled people particularly hard. But it is the social and economic processes. In fact, I'm actually going to say that actually a social model actually should have start to deal with the material issues in terms of the fact that disabled people and people it affects have no say in treatment, have no say in defining disability, have no um have no say in any of this stuff. So that's where I'm at. Um, really, and I can talk about that later, perhaps on videos and things of that nature. Um, but not many people know about the social model. Not many people know about there is actually a model of social oppression. There is a model of um, disability that explains it as there's an element of social and economic issues, not just oh you're poor but you still you're in a wheelchair or with a Tourette's whatever. You understand that when I read this for the first time in 2018, this book, I felt seen for the first time in my life, properly seen, not just the autistic part of me or other neurodivergent parts. I mean the social, economic issues in activist spaces, in political spaces, analysis of why I'm oppressed, why my ancestors are oppressed, why the friends and comrades round about me that I have now are oppressed. It is equivalent to black people finding black revolutionaries, speaking to them. It is equivalent of queer and LGBT people finding Sylvia and others, the radical speakers and trans people and those that started Stonewall. It is that level of being seen and being understood and our suffering and a way to fight back against the forces of institutionalization, exclusion, and, dare say it, the erasure of disabled people. I'll talk more about this later, but I hope this way is a lot better, and I will hopefully this way will help a lot of people so they can read along with other books I've got. I will actually at some point put a more obscure political theories and authors like John McMurtry in the kind of stage of capitalism and value wars, about his analysis on modern capitalism and thoughts about that as well, because I read that to a couple of people in some extracts and people found it really amazing and people think my way of reading is really good. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for everyone for watching. I know it's a bit of a long stream, it's like almost an hour, but yeah, you're welcome, and take care everyone, and yeah.